The year was 1940, and Europe was burning. Across the gray skies of France and the Low Countries, the German Luftwaffe ruled the air like a steel storm. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek, deadly, and precise, was the pride of the Reich, and German pilots boasted that no enemy could touch them. They had reason to be confident. Britain was reeling, France had fallen, and America was still a whisper across the Atlantic. In the smoke-choked hangars of England, however, a quiet project was underway. A plane not yet born, a machine that even its creators didn't fully believe in. It began not in the grand halls of the U.S. War Department, but in the offices of a small company called North American Aviation. When the British Air Purchasing Commission approached them in 1940, asking if they could license build a P-40 Tomahawk, the Americans replied with an audacious offer: "We can build you something better." The British laughed. Better, from Americans who had never designed a fighter before. The Germans would have laughed harder. For all their mechanical genius, the Americans were still, in European eyes, a land of dreamers and industrial farmers. They built cars, refrigerators, tractors, not war machines that could dance with the Luftwaffe's angels of death. Yet within just 120 days, the engineers at North American rolled out a prototype, the NA-73X. It looked sleek, almost too clean. A narrow fuselage, laminar flow wings, a radiator scoop beneath the belly. British test pilots took it up in October 1940, and reports were mixed. Fast and level flight, yes, but poor at high altitudes, underpowered, a bit clumsy in tight turns. A plane that could not yet climb to meet the Messerschmitt. A good trainer, perhaps. Certainly not a killer. When word of the Mustang reached German intelligence, Luftwaffe officers smirked. "The Americans," one officer wrote, "think they can outfly us with their mass-produced tin toys. They build like they make toasters." The Mustang became a joke in pilot lounges, another Allied experiment destined to fall short of the precision German engineering demanded. But deep in that laughter hid the first fatal crack in the German mind: arrogance. The same arrogance that would lead them to dismiss the Soviets' crude tanks, the Americans' industrial potential, and the very idea that simplicity could outperform genius. While Germany obsessed over perfection, fine-tuning every bolt, every piston, the Allies began to think bigger, faster, cheaper. They didn't want the perfect plane. They wanted the right one. For now, though, the Mustang gathered dust on the sidelines. It flew low-altitude missions for the RAF, reconnaissance, ground attack, escorting bombers only over France's northern fields. Its Allison engine gasped for air above 15,000 feet, where the real war, the bomber war, was being fought. The pilots liked it, but the war planners shrugged, another American attempt that almost worked. Then came the winter of 1942. Across the Atlantic, America was now at war. The Pacific burned, and over Europe the daylight bombing campaign began. Flying fortresses, the mighty B-17s, thundered across the channel in tight formations bound for the industrial heart of Germany. The plan was bold: destroy the Reich's war machine from the sky. But it had a fatal flaw. The bombers had to fly unescorted. High over Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg, the Luftwaffe pounced. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts tore through the bomber streams like wolves through sheep. The sky was shredded metal and falling fire. On the ground, German civilians cheered as the smoking hulks of American bombers rained down. "The Americans," Goering boasted, "will never reach Berlin." He believed it. Everyone did. until a few engineers and pilots decided not to. At a British airfield in mid-1943, a group of mechanics gathered around a new experiment, a P-51 Mustang, not with its usual Allison engine, but with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. When test pilot Ronald Harker took it up, he came down shaking his head, not in disappointment, but disbelief. "It's the best damn plane I've ever flown." Now the laughter stopped. The Mustang, the tin toy, had found its soul. With the Merlin, the P-51 could climb to 40,000 feet, race at over 430 miles per hour, and fly farther than any fighter the world had ever seen. Its laminar flow wings sliced through the air with surgical precision. Its range was so vast that it could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. When the news reached German intelligence, Goering refused to believe it. "No fighter can fly from England to Berlin and fight," he scoffed. But soon his pilots began to report otherwise. "The silver ones, the ones with the long legs, they don't turn back." The Americans had built not a plane, but a Predator. The Mustang wasn't faster than every German fighter, nor more heavily armed, but it could be everywhere. It was a ghost in the clouds, waiting at the end of every bomber run, diving from the sun, vanishing into the haze. It turned the daylight sky into a trap. And in the frozen dawns of late 1943, the trap began to close. The dawn over occupied Europe was bone white, streaked with smoke trails that looked like scars on the sky. The Luftwaffe still ruled those heights, or so they thought. German pilots had grown used to the rhythm of the hunt, the distant hum of American bombers, the shimmering glint of aluminum formations, the slow climb, the kill. They knew the bombers by their shapes, their smells, even their sounds. Like cattle, one German ace had once sneered. Big, loud, and blind. But in the winter of 1943, the music changed. It began with whispers on the radios. A new escort, silver and slim, flying higher and faster than the old Thunderbolts. German pilots dismissed it as a trick, another Allied exaggeration. Then, on a mission to Bremen, the first Mustang showed its teeth. A Luftwaffe formation diving in on the bombers suddenly found themselves under fire from above. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a veteran of over 200 missions, described the shock in his diary. "We came down on the bombers as usual. Then tracers passed by my canopy, green, fast, from above. It was an American. Impossible. They should not have the height or the range. But there he was, turning with me, and I could not shake him. The hunter had become the hunted." The P-51 didn't just fly, it haunted. Its pilots learned to stalk from the sun, to dive with gravity's fury, to pull up with just enough thrust to vanish. Its guns, 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, spat a storm of lead that could rip the wings off a Messerschmitt in seconds. What made it deadlier still was its endurance. German fighters could only stay airborne for 45 minutes to an hour over the Reich. The P-51s could escort bombers for more than 4. They didn't just appear, they lingered. German pilots would look over their shoulders and see nothing. Then suddenly, tracers, a glint of silver, a kill. It was psychological warfare as much as mechanical. Luftwaffe pilots, once lions of the sky, began to fear the unknown. Rumors spread in ready rooms and bunkers. They called them the long-range devils. Major General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's famous ace and tactician, realized the truth too late. When the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, he later said, "I knew the war was lost." Meanwhile, on the ground, American crews prepared their machines with ritual precision. The Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a craftsman's revenge. Every rivet, every polish, every engine hum mattered. Pilots gave their planes names: Big Beautiful Doll, Glamorous Glen, Old Crow. The men were barely out of boyhood, 22, 23, but they carried the weight of nations on their shoulders. Their briefings were brutal. Your job is to stay with the bombers. If they go down, you go down with them. They knew that out there, the German guns waited like vipers, 88mm flak shells that burst in black clouds, Focke-Wulfs diving with cannon fire. But the Mustang pilots were different. They weren't flying just to survive. They were flying to prove something, that American steel could match, even surpass German genius. Captain Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, was one of those men. Before the Mustang, he had fought in Spitfires for the RAF. He knew what German arrogance looked like. He also knew how it cracked. The first time we hit them over Berlin, they didn't believe it. You could see it in the way they broke. They weren't used to being hunted. On March 6, 1944, the first full daylight raid on Berlin took off. 800 bombers, nearly 600 fighters, many of them P-51s. The Germans threw everything into the sky to stop them. Jagdgeschwader 26, 54, 1, all elite fighter wings. The air over Germany became a boiling cauldron of contrails and fire. One Luftwaffe pilot, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, described the sight. There were silver lines everywhere. It was not combat, it was chaos. We were no longer masters of the air. We were targets. From 30,000 feet, the world looked like madness. Bombers droned forward in iron discipline, while black puffs of flak exploded around them. Out of nowhere, a squadron of P-51s screamed down, sunlight flashing off their canopies, guns blazing. Messerschmitts broke formation, diving for safety, but the Mustangs followed, relentless. In the chaos, a Mustang pilot named Major John C. Meyer spotted a German ace tailing a B-17. He rolled inverted, dropped altitude fast, and opened fire. The German plane erupted in flames, spiraling toward the forest below. Meyer didn't celebrate. He climbed again, searching for the next threat. By the end of that raid, the Luftwaffe had lost over 60 fighters. The Americans lost less than a dozen. For the first time, German civilians heard American engines over their capital and saw bombers that did not fall. The invincible Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in its own skies. But what broke Germany wasn't just numbers, it was faith. Faith in their superiority, their craftsmanship, their belief that precision could outlast mass. The Mustang was the embodiment of everything they despised. A machine built by a factory line, not an artisan's hand. Yet it worked beautifully. In Stuttgart and Bremen, the whispers turned into despair. Ground crews watched as new pilots, barely trained, barely alive, took off in the latest Bf-109s and Fw-190s, only to vanish into the haze. Germany could no longer replace its aces. Every Mustang kill was not just a plane lost, it was a legacy extinguished. In Allied command rooms, the tone changed. The Mustang was now the scalpel of the air war. Pilots were ordered to go beyond escort duties, seek out the Luftwaffe, destroy it on the ground if you must. They dove on airfields, strafing parked planes, fuel trucks and hangars. They hunted trains, convoys, even motorcycles. The Mustang became a reaper of industry, cutting through the arteries of the Reich. And still, the Germans remembered how they had laughed. In Berlin, Goering reportedly stood on the balcony of the Air Ministry, staring up at the contrails over the city. When his officers told him the American fighters were over Berlin itself, he said nothing, just watched. Later he muttered, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew it was all over." The laughter had long died. What replaced it was silence, the silence of disbelief. By summer 1944, the air over Europe belonged to the Silver Wings. The Mustangs escorted the bombers to Munich, Leipzig, and back again. The Luftwaffe tried new tactics, desperate ambushes, even suicide runs, but the Mustang's range, speed, and coordination shattered them. The sky that once echoed with German confidence was now filled with an American hum, a sound that meant death to some and salvation to others. And in the workshops of North American aviation, workers who had once doubted their creation now stood beside assembly lines with tears in their eyes. Their toy had become history's most feared predator. But the war was not yet done. Ahead lay the most desperate battles: the Ardennes, the Rhine, the heart of Germany itself. And the Mustang's legend was just beginning. By the summer of 1944, the war had changed its rhythm. The thunder that once rose from German engines now came from the west, from England's fields, where rows of P-51 Mustangs sat gleaming beneath the morning haze. Their wings glimmered like knives under the sun, their noses painted with names of girls, hometowns, or jokes scrawled in chalk. Every dawn, the same ritual played out. The pilot's silence before takeoff, the low growl of Merlins warming up, the final cigarette stubbed into the mud. They knew that once they crossed the channel, it was kill or be killed, and yet they went. For the Luftwaffe, the war had become a slow suffocation. The airfields that once pulsed with life were now targets. Mustangs roamed the skies like hawks, diving on anything that moved: fuel trucks, convoys, even lone couriers. The Germans called it the terror of the open sky. One morning, in late July, a Luftwaffe mechanic named Erich Bauer stood beside a half-buried bunker near Le Mans, listening to the sound of engines, American ones. "You could hear them long before you saw them," he wrote later. "They had a sound like rolling thunder, and when you looked up, the sun flashed off their wings like mirrors. We knew what came next." When the Mustangs dived, there was no time to run. The 50 caliber guns shredded everything below. Fuel barrels burst into fireballs, engines, trucks, even bicycles were torn apart. When they pulled up, they left only silence, broken metal and smoke rising over fields. The German ground crews started painting fake aircraft on airfields, desperate to trick the Mustangs into wasting ammunition. But it didn't work. The Americans were relentless. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group was one of them. They called him the Ace Maker. On April 8, 1944, he and his wingman destroyed 3 German aircraft before breakfast. Gentile's Mustang, Shangri-La, returned with bullet holes in its tail and a smear of oil across its wings. When a journalist asked him how it felt, Gentile laughed softly. "It feels like revenge," he said. But the laughter was thin. The skies over Europe were beautiful and cruel. Pilots often returned with empty seats in their formations. One moment you'd be joking with your friend on the runway, the next you'd see his plane vanish in a flash of flame miles above the clouds. Lieutenant John Godfrey once described it this way: "It's like watching a sunset that never ends, only it's made of burning metal." By autumn, the Luftwaffe was cracking. Allied bombers, now almost untouchable under Mustang escort, pounded the German heartland day after day. Factories in Leipzig, oil plants in Ploiești, the ball-bearing works of Schweinfurt, all burning. Each mission carved deeper into the Reich's war machine. Yet the Germans refused to give up. From the ruins of their airfields, they released their final gambles, the Me-262 jet fighters, sleek, terrifying, faster than anything in the sky. Hitler believed they would be his salvation, a miracle weapon that could turn the tide. But even the Me-262 was too late. The jets could climb like demons, but they needed long, exposed runways, and the Mustangs were waiting. Allied intelligence had mapped every possible jet base, and P-51 pilots began patrolling near them like wolves. The moment a jet took off or tried to land, they struck. Major James Sully of the 8th Air Force described one such mission. "We caught them low, their wheels barely up. They were faster, yes, but not invincible. We tore through the runway. You could see the jets flipping, burning, the ground crew scattered like ants." It was a new kind of hunting, merciless, surgical. For every jet that took off, 3 were destroyed before they left the ground. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's air superiority had disintegrated. Germany's skies belonged to the Mustangs. But the war on the ground was far from over. In December came the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate counterattack in the Ardennes. Fog and snow grounded most Allied planes for days, giving German tanks free rein. American soldiers were pinned, freezing, dying. The sky had gone silent. Then, on December 23rd, the weather cleared. Blue skies spread across Belgium like a miracle. Within hours, squadrons of P-51s roared into the air. They flew low over the white forests, scanning for columns of armor. The first targets appeared, German tanks trying to cross frozen roads. The Mustangs dived, guns blazing. Fire streaked across the snow. Panzer turrets exploded, trucks flipped, and German infantry scattered for cover. For the men on the ground, the Mustangs were angels. One American infantryman in Bastogne remembered looking up and crying when he saw them. He said they came out of nowhere, silver angels with fire in their wings. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene, but what few planes they had left were torn apart. The sky was no longer theirs. Even their best aces were gone, dead, captured, or exhausted. By early 1945, German pilots were flying suicide missions. The Reich threw teenagers into cockpits with only weeks of training. Against the seasoned Mustang squadrons, it was slaughter. Captain Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first man to break the sound barrier, flew Mustangs over Germany that winter. He said, "We weren't fighting pilots anymore. We were fighting ghosts. They didn't have the heart left." But the fighting didn't end cleanly. Every mission took something from the men who flew them. The sky was victory, but it was also graveyard. When a Mustang pilot didn't come back, the others wouldn't talk about it. They'd just clean out his locker and fly again. The Mustang had become a machine of paradoxes, beautiful yet brutal, elegant yet soaked in death. By March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Mustangs were untouchable. They flew so deep into German territory that some pilots joked they could see the snow on the Alps. But beneath the triumph was a strange emptiness. The Luftwaffe was gone. There were no more dogfights, just ruins and smoke. Lieutenant Colonel John D. Landers wrote in his journal, "We rule the air now, but it feels like shouting into an empty room." On April 11th, the 8th Air Force launched one of its final great raids, 1,200 bombers escorted by 800 Mustangs. They flew over a dying Germany, its cities reduced to ashes. On that day, few German planes even rose to meet them. The war that had begun with laughter and arrogance was ending in silence. The Mustangs didn't know peace yet. Their engines still roared, their wings still gleamed, but the fight was nearly done. Ahead lay Berlin, and the end of everything that once seemed invincible. The final spring of the war came with a cruel beauty. Across Europe, the frost melted to reveal the scars of battle. Burned forests, twisted steel, and airfields that looked like skeletons of machines long dead. But above it all, the sky remained alive. Every morning, the silver wings rose again. April 1945. The P-51 Mustang ruled the heavens. By now, it wasn't a war for air superiority, it was a mop-up of what was left of the Luftwaffe's pride. The once mighty German Air Force that had terrorized Europe in 1939 was now a shadow. A handful of desperate pilots, many barely old enough to shave, flying outdated Bf-109s from fields littered with wreckage. When the Mustangs appeared, they didn't even fight. They fled. In one of his last flights, Colonel Don Blakesley led his men deep into Germany, hunting rail lines and supply convoys retreating toward Bavaria. The sky was a vast gray sheet, trembling with the sound of Merlin engines. Below, the roads shimmered with movement, columns of trucks, horses, refugees, and tanks. "Hit everything that moves," came the order. Blakesley dove. His Mustang howled through the clouds, guns flashing. A line of German trucks erupted in fire. Others scattered into the ditches. The war that had begun with precision had now become chaos. Brutal, unstoppable. From the ground, German civilians looked up, dazed. The silver planes no longer meant battle. They meant ending. At a small village near Kassel, a lieutenant named Karl Wurzer ran toward his last aircraft, a Bf-109 patched together with scrap metal and oil drums. His commander shouted at him to stay, but Karl refused. "If I don't fly, they'll come for us here." He managed to lift off, barely. As he climbed into the pale morning, he saw them. 3 Mustangs, circling like hawks. He turned toward a cloud bank, heart pounding. The first burst of tracers missed by inches. The second hit his wing. He felt the plane shudder, saw smoke fill the cockpit. His engine died. As he bailed out, he looked down and thought, "This is what arrogance looks like when it falls." The Mustang pilots didn't know his name. They didn't cheer. They just turned back to their formation and kept flying. Across Germany, the same scenes played out 100 times a day. Luftwaffe bases were craters. German fuel depots bombed to black glass. Even when a handful of Me-26-2 jets took to the air, they were swarmed before they could climb. By the end of April, the Luftwaffe was no longer a fighting force. It was a memory. In the towns below, the sound of American engines had become a strange comfort. Villagers began waving white sheets when they saw the Mustangs, praying that the silver planes would spare them. The Americans weren't bombing civilians now. They were hunting what was left of the machine that had started the war. In one haunting moment, a Mustang pilot named Lieutenant Robert Hutchinson flew over Dachau without realizing what it was. From the air, he saw long gray barracks, fences, and motionless figures. Only later, when Allied ground troops liberated the camp, did he understand what he'd flown over. He said, "We were fighting a war of machines. But that day I saw what we were really fighting for." The Mustang had given the Allies control of the sky, but it had also given them a vantage point from which to see the full horror of the Reich. On April 25, 1945, came the final great mission, the Berlin air raids. More than 1,500 bombers thundered eastward, escorted by a wall of Mustangs. The sky was thick with contrails, the air vibrating like a living thing. Below lay the ruined capital of the Third Reich, streets in rubble, the Reichstag scarred and hollow, the Spree River choked with debris. Göring, once master of the skies, sat in his country estate, cut off from command. His pilots were dead or scattered. His once boastful words, "No enemy will ever fly over the Reich," now sounded like a curse. When the first P-51s appeared over Berlin, few Germans even looked up. They were used to it now, the endless roar, the hum of defeat. For the Mustang pilots, it was both triumph and tragedy. They had trained to fight an enemy, but now there was no one to fight. They watched from above as Soviet artillery pounded the city, the red flashes below marking the end of the Reich. Major George Preddy, one of the top Mustang aces, had written months before his death, "We fly through a heaven made of hellfire. The more we win, the less we recognize the victory." And that was the truth of the Mustang's legacy. It had conquered the air, but at a price that no one could measure. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, the skies were quiet for the first time in 6 years. At Allied airfields, the pilots climbed out of their cockpits and stood looking at their planes. Some laughed, some cried, some said nothing at all. They had built a weapon so perfect that it erased the very enemy it was made to fight. In the days that followed, the Mustang squadrons were grounded. Mechanics began painting over the nose art. Glamorous Glen, Old Crow, Big Beautiful Doll, all destined for museums or scrapyards. Yet in those last moments, the pilots knew what the Mustang truly meant. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a story. A story of arrogance defeated by adaptation, of a joke that became a legend. It was proof that genius doesn't always come from perfection. It comes from necessity, from the will to learn faster than your enemy can laugh. As one engineer from North American Aviation later said, "They mocked us for building fast and simple, but that's how we won. The Germans built temples. We built tools." The Luftwaffe dreamed of mechanical immortality, a sky full of masterpieces. But war doesn't reward masterpieces. It rewards endurance. And in that contest, the Mustang was king. When the last Mustangs flew over the shattered cities of Germany, children looked up and waved. The silver wings glinted in the pale sun, disappearing into the clouds. Down below, the ruins of the Luftwaffe lay scattered like fallen idols, the remains of an empire that had worshipped the machine more than the man. The laughter that once filled German hangars was gone forever, replaced by the hum of factories in Detroit and California, where new planes were already being built. The age of the German sky was over, but the Mustang, the plane they laughed at, had become eternal.
The war was over, but the echoes of its engines didn't fade so easily. Across Europe, silence replaced the thunder. Burned cities lay under drifting smoke, fields were littered with twisted aluminum, and the people who had survived looked up at skies that no longer growled. Yet, for those who had fought there, the silence was almost unbearable. For men like Don Blakesley, George Preedy, and countless others, peace felt alien. They had spent years with the world trembling beneath their wings. Now the ground was still. The P-51 Mustang, once a lifeline and a weapon, now sat quietly in hangars, its polished frame gathering dust. But even in stillness, the legend grew. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied pilots returned home with stories that seemed almost mythic. They told of flying through walls of flak over Berlin, of chasing down Me-262 jets at dawn, of watching burning towns pass beneath them like constellations turned to ash. In one small bar in Suffolk, a young pilot from the 352nd Fighter Group raised a glass and said, "We didn't just win the sky, we rewrote it." And he wasn't wrong. The Mustang had changed everything. Before it, no one thought a single-engine fighter could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. No one believed that a plane could combine such speed, range, and agility. It was a machine born out of desperation and doubt, and yet it had brought down one of the greatest air powers the world had ever seen. In Germany, the aftermath told a different story. Captured Luftwaffe pilots walked through their ruined airfields in silence. Once these places had been alive with laughter, swagger, and the hum of Messerschmitts warming up. Now only the wind remained. Karl Wurzer, the same young pilot who had bailed out during that final dogfight, was among the survivors. In an Allied POW camp, he would later tell an American officer, "We thought you built toys, but your toys didn't break." That line, translated and reprinted in post-war magazines, became symbolic of the entire conflict. The Germans had built machines for perfection. The Americans had built machines for war. And that difference, more than any bullet or bomb, had decided the skies. In 1946, the Mustang was no longer just an American hero. It became an international standard. Dozens of countries bought them, flew them, and studied them. Britain kept the Mustang in service as the RAF's Cadillac of the sky. Sweden used it to patrol the Baltic. Even Israel, when it fought its first war of independence, flew Mustangs salvaged from scrapyards, repainting them with new symbols of freedom. But perhaps the most poetic chapter came with Korea. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, jets had already taken over. Sleek F-86 Sabres roared across the peninsula. Yet when the United Nations needed a ground attack plane that could handle dirt runways and fly for hours, it was the old P-51 they called back. The Mustang rose again. It roared over Korea's mountains like a ghost from another age, machine guns rattling, propellers slicing through thin air, the last great bird of the piston era proving that it still had fight left in its wings. Even as jet pilots laughed at its old-fashioned propeller, they respected it. Many had fathers who had flown it. One pilot famously said, "If you ever doubt what courage sounds like, listen to a Mustang diving at full throttle." Back in America, the legends were immortalized. Hollywood made films about the heroes who flew them. Children built model kits of gleaming Mustangs, painting shark teeth on the nose and dreaming of the open sky. In air shows, veterans stood by restored planes, running their hands along the cool metal as if greeting an old friend. And then there was the sound, the unmistakable growl of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Every time it roared to life, crowds would go silent. Some said it sounded like music. Others said it sounded like victory itself. One old pilot, gray-haired and teary-eyed, once said at a reunion, "When I hear that sound, I'm 20 again, and the sky is mine." But beyond nostalgia, the Mustang's legacy carried a deeper truth, one carved into the very history of war itself. It taught the world that innovation doesn't always come from power or pride. It comes from humility. The Allies didn't win the skies because they started smarter. They won because they adapted faster.
When the Germans built faster planes, the Allies built longer-range ones. When the Luftwaffe trained elite pilots, the Allies trained thousands. When arrogance met practicality, practicality endured. As one historian put it, the Luftwaffe chased perfection, the Allies chased victory. The P-51 Mustang was victory made metal. Even today, when one flies overhead, its shadow seems to carry all the weight of that era. The hum of its propeller whispers of the men who never returned, the ones who vanished into smoke over Normandy, Arnhem, or the Ardennes. At the same time, it's a symbol of redemption, a machine that began as a joke and ended as a legend. In museums from London to Washington, visitors stand before it in quiet awe. They see more than rivets and steel. They see courage, ingenuity, and the strange poetry of human survival. Children press their faces to the glass, reading the names painted under the cockpit. Big Beautiful Doll, Old Crow, Lou the Fourth. Those were more than call signs. They were fragments of humanity painted onto a weapon. The Mustang's pilots weren't just warriors. They were young men who scribbled love notes on bomb doors, tucked photos of sweethearts into flight suits, and prayed under the stars between missions. And so the story of the P-51 Mustang isn't just about victory. It's about transformation. It's about how laughter turned into fear, how mockery became myth, how a handful of engineers in California changed the course of history because they refused to accept that perfection had already been achieved somewhere else. From the first flight over the English Channel to the last patrol over Korea, the Mustang carried not just bombs and bullets, but hope. The hope that the sky could be more than a battlefield, that humanity could learn from the wreckage below. In the end, it wasn't just an airplane. It was a symbol of every aviadog who has ever been doubted, every engineer who's ever been told impossible, every pilot who's looked at the horizon and thought just a little further. The Luftwaffe's laughter may have once filled the air, but when the war was over, only one sound remained. The echo of the Merlin engine rolling softly through history. A sound that said simply, "Never underestimate what can rise from ridicule."